So we're talking today with Palo Alto Mayor Eric Filseth about the housing crisis, some of his ideas about the root causes, and why SB50 may not be the solution that some people think it might be. So Eric, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Very nice to be here.
Yeah. So in your State of the City speech this week, it was slightly different from other states of the city. Do you pluralize states? Yeah, I think. Other speeches, in that you went beyond kind of a summary of what's happening in the city and what some of the priorities are, and went towards talking about housing and kind of taking a deep dive there. You mentioned Senate Bill 50, the More Homes Act, and said that it will only produce a few turns of the screw when it comes to easing the housing shortage, and it wouldn't address the fundamental problems that need to be fixed. So I wanted to start off by asking you about sustainable development. You had this chart where on one side there was expansion of jobs, and on the other side was expansion of housing, and the line that went kind of up and to the right. So it seems to me that SB50 is designed to expand the housing supply. So I'm wondering, is your thought that SB50 is not appropriate in terms of the quantity of housing that it would provide to kind of offset the jobs? Or is that not really the main point of your thoughts on that?
A little both. I think it would take quite a long time to do what it wants to do. I think it's, if you look at the housing growth, if you look at the housing permitting and growth in the Silicon Valley over the last 40, 50 years. The last 40 years, it's been pretty constant. Between San Mateo and Santa Clara counties, and it's basically moved back and forth between 5,000 or 10,000 units a year for 40 years now. It was a little bit higher in the 70s, okay, but not that much. And so this idea that we're going to make zoning changes and suddenly we're going to get a 300% or 500% increase or more in housing production. I mean, it's hard to explain how that could happen because there's very little precedent for it. Now, I think you could do a fair amount over a long period of time, but really the real problem with housing is the economics at this point, right? I think the way the valley runs right now, the economics for commercial development versus residential development they're quite a bit skewed toward commercial development. That's why you see so much of it and so little housing. The other problem with SB50 is it's targeted entirely toward market rate housing. And there are some people that think that if you build a lot of luxury housing, then it will trickle down to low and mid-wage earners and so forth. But there's not a huge amount of compelling evidence, and there's a lot of counter evidence for that as well. So I think that's an overdrawn conclusion. And I think if you look at what most people in Palo Alto want, they want to see some relief for low and mid-wage earners, right, as opposed to high earners. And there's enormous skepticism in town, and justifiable, I think, that building sort of modest amounts of luxury housing will actually provide any relief to those kinds of people.
But you yourself pointed out during the speech that the city's fund for helping affordable housing projects is pretty much depleted after spending $10 million on the Wilton Court development. So if the city can't provide funding for these projects, which you acknowledge are way more expensive than market rate housing, doesn't that result mean no housing at all?
Well, it means slow housing, right? At least slow affordable housing until you replenish that. But I think there's actions that we can take both as a city and as a region to try to address that. I think, and a lot of people have talked about this, but it seems reasonably likely that the really core fundamental problem is that coming out of the recession, the industry of the valley was so successful, so fast. I mean, you got to remember, it's only 9 years since the end of the recession. It's not that long, right? It was so successful, so fast that sort of some of the core management processes you anticipate, including investing in your long-term infrastructure, simply haven't kept up. And what that means, I think, in the valley is, a key part of that is the housing and transportation infrastructure that it takes to support that level of economic growth. Right? I think that hasn't kept up. And as we look about, how do we fund more kinds of housing? Because the fundamental problem in affordable and below below market rate housing, which at this point is pretty much everybody except high-end software engineers, okay, is money. So how are we going to invest in that? How are we going to keep that investment up? And I think there needs to be some more balance. Now, everybody who has property or a good job in the valley has benefited from the boom, right? And I think we all bear some responsibility in that. But the balance of, how much of the housing and transportation infrastructure needed to support the valley economy, how much of it comes directly from sort of the areas that generate wealth in the valley versus property taxes and sales taxes and so forth, for example, and communities. I think that balance, we need to adjust that balance. And I think the state should have a role too. And the governor in his budget speech in January called for what he called a Marshall Plan for housing in the state. And he called on Sacramento to contribute, and he called on some of the leading corporations in this area to contribute at a higher level. And I think that makes a lot of sense. You got to look at it as an investment in the future.
I feel like I've heard various criticism of Senate Bill 50 from both sides, like some people saying, like you said at the State of the City speech, that it doesn't do enough because it doesn't address the economics of it. But at the same time, you showed renderings of like large houses in Palo Alto locations, the hypothetical buildings that will look like, which seems a little more aligned with the other kind of criticism I hear, which is if SB50 succeeds, it's going to overwhelm things.
Yeah, right.
So are you afraid it's going to do too much or not enough? Or both?
Well, I think it's going to do a little bit for high-income people, and only high-income people.
So those 4-story buildings are luxury apartments.
Yeah, they're going to go, well, the whole focus is market rate, so they're going to be just as expensive as everything else. But yet the Bay Area continued, I mean, the local region, right, not Palo Alto, because we've clamped down on it. So Palo Alto, via its office caps, have clamped down on job growth. But high-end job growth continues very rapidly in some of the surrounding cities. And so, yeah, I think most of if we were to do that, most of that expansion would go to the people that can bid up those dwelling units, right? And that would be those kinds of people. Again, there are people that look at that in Palo Alto, and there's a sizable number of people in Palo Alto that look at big apartment buildings in Eichler neighborhoods and go, yeah, we should do that. We need to do that. Here's the 3 reasons we should, and it makes a lot of sense. And that's a legitimate perspective. But what SB50 and some of these Sacramento bills do is they make it mandatory, right? I mean, it's one thing if we decide to do it ourselves in town and we say, yep, majority of our people want to see us go that way, and we do it. A few years later, if we like it, we do more. If we don't like it, we say, we ought to go revisit that and not do any more. But if Sacramento does it, it's done. Okay, right? And so I think the importance of the local ability to balance those kinds of needs is very important. And also, I mean, essentially what some of these mandates do is they basically take away voters' ability to decide what their community looks like. And I think that's a direction we shouldn't go in this country, okay, let alone in this state.
Go ahead.
So one of the criticisms there is that the state is thinking about the whole, the broad problem, and that if you leave it up to communities, then communities aren't doing their fair share, quote unquote fair share, whatever.
Right.
So what is the balance in your mind between the state being able to pressure or incentivize communities to act appropriately?
Right. Well, I actually think there is a role for the state in this. I don't think micromanaging zoning in neighborhoods is the right role for the state. I think it's going to be very, very difficult for the state to get that right, and it's improper to take it away from the people that live there. That said, I do think there is one bad behavior, I'll use the word quote unquote bad behavior, right, that ought to get regulated. And I actually like the way the governor sort of approached it as opposed to some of these legislative bills. Right? But if you have a city that approves, I think the concept of a housing deficit is important, okay, which is the difference between the demand for housing that you produce by a commercial development versus the amount that actually gets built in your city. So I think the bad behavior on cities' parts is you approve large commercial projects that have a big housing deficit, collect some money via development agreements and go spend it on city amenities, and basically export the housing deficit to the cities next door. So I think it actually makes sense for Sacramento to regulate that, because the kind of things Sacramento ought to regulate are things where one city does something, one local jurisdiction does something to the detriment of another local jurisdiction. And you shouldn't let people do that. So I think Sacramento ought to regulate jobs production versus housing production, or commercial development versus residential development, or however you want to measure that problem. And I threw out commercial development relative to housing development because I think that's easy to measure and it's a good proxy.
But I'm curious,
cities can regulate it already.
do you think Palo Alto is guilty of that? I mean, the council has done a few things on housing. It's approved a couple of developments in the last year. It has come nowhere near meeting its goal. You still have a ton of jobs, the worst jobs housing imbalance. So if you say you're against cities kind of exporting their problems, isn't that what's happening when you have a 3-to-1?
I think we have. I think we have done a bunch of that, and I think all cities in the region have done that. And I think starting a couple of years ago, Palo Alto moved to curtail that quite a bit. There's not a lot we can do about what's been done in the past, but I think going forward, it's important that we be a good neighbor to other cities and not do it anymore. And Palo Alto, if you look at the clamp down on jobs we've done with the office caps, and the downtown cap that was voided a month ago was really one of the minor ones. The major ones are the 50,000 square feet a year and the citywide office cap adopted by, it was a citizen initiative adopted by council last summer. Those are the major ones, right? So if you look at the combination of our job growth attenuation and our historical housing production, it's about 150 units a year over the last several decades, and some of the comp plan measures like the ADU ordinance and so forth, where we want to get to, there's a balance there going forward in it. And there's not a lot we can do about the past, but we can affect it's the first thing you do is stop digging the hole deeper, right? And so I think if every city were to rebalance its development incentives to put a better economic balance between commercial and residential, then as a region we'd work our way out of this problem, and it wouldn't require micromanaging setbacks in neighborhoods from Sacramento.
And you mentioned...
And that's the way government works.
Yeah, you mentioned a few things during your speech to help achieve that balance. One of them is potentially increasing the commercial impact fees, which the council did for a minute last year before it was reversed after the election, or 2 years ago. I'm curious if this is an issue that you want to see the council take up one more time.
I do.
If this is something you will proactively push forward.
I do. I think we ought to do that. I think the county adopted $68 a square foot for that area, right? And I think that ought to be a priority for the council this year, and I'm gonna attempt to build some momentum for it.
So is there a colleague's memo we should look forward to on that subject? You want to break some news here? Okay.
Not at this time. There's not one yet.
Well,
we have a lot of work ahead of us this year.
Fair enough, but I also wanted to ask about the 300 homes per year target. The council and planning staff has done a lot to kind of change the zoning laws to kind of further that, but the city still hasn't come close. Do you still think that's a relatively reasonable target? Should it be reduced? And are there other things that you think the city should do to get to 300?
Right. Well, I mean, part of the challenge here is that the cycles of this take a while. Okay, I mean, you put an ordinance in place. It takes a while. I mean, we approved the VTA lot housing project a couple of years ago, and it still hasn't broken ground yet, or so forth. I mean, there's some time cycles in this. What we did with the comp plan is we adopted the target, right, which is 300 a year or 250 or whatever the math works out to, right, and we began adjusting knobs. And I think we're going to keep adjusting knobs. So the first thing we did with the ADU ordinance, and that's produced a substantial uptick in ADU developments. I mean, again, we're talking about fairly small numbers. It's pretty easy to scale from, half a dozen to 40 or 50. It's much harder to scale from 10,000 to 50,000, right? But so that's so we produced an uptick there. We passed the 2019 ordinance back in the last month, and so we're going to see if that makes a difference as well. And I think there's going to be some time lags in this, and that's just the way these things work. I do want to give a shout out for a very good book that if people want to understand this stuff, they ought to read, which is
City Budget?
Well, there's that one too, right? No, this made the rounds last year. Richard Walker's Pictures of a Gone City that I cited actually in my presentation. I highly recommend this. You kind of got to get past its politics a little bit, but he's done a magnificent piece of research and analysis on industry, housing, climate, environment in the Bay Area, and I think he's done a tremendous piece of research on this. If you want to understand the housing market, you can't do much better than do this. Right? So he talks about a lot of these issues. Right?
You mentioned just a minute ago commercial impact fees. What about business taxes?
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense too, right? I mean, all this stuff the fundamental, again, the issue on all of this is who's going to pay for it. And I think, Wilton Court, I think, in affordable housing, it's a microcosm for this, right? Which is, if you want it, somebody's got to pay for it. How do you pay for it? And if you believe that the problem is underinvestment in our housing and transportation and even community infrastructure over the last years since the recession, you say, okay, well, we want to increase investment. Where should it come from? It ought to come from sort of where the wealth is generated, right? Which tends to be primarily in the Bay Area, the tech companies, commercial development, and to some extent healthcare companies. That's an awful lot of it, right? And so you say, okay, how are we going to level set that a little bit, right? Again, everybody's got to contribute. The question is, where's the balance right? And so, so a business tax goes to that, impact fees go to that. If you look at what Mountain View and East Palo Alto and San Francisco have done, that go to that as well. And I think that's the direction that makes sense to go. And then the question is, how do we do it right? Again, we're talking about new investment. There's a move afoot to tax parts of future property tax increases. I don't think that's new investment. I mean, those dollars are already committed to, labor raises and stuff like that. We're talking about new investment here.
Are we going to see corporate housing?
I would not be surprised. I think.
Do you think that would be company generated, as in company, like on their initiative, or would that be from the government putting pressure on them?
In my view, the proper role for government is to decide who pays for things. That's part of it, and to regulate land use. That's one of the things we do. Should the government mandate that employers build housing versus pay impact fees and other people build it and it's reinvested and so forth? I'm not sure, right? But that's fundamentally where it ought to come from. I do think you're likely to see corporate housing. I mean, as I mentioned the other night, I was talking to the CEO of one of our local nonprofits, and they're talking about corporate housing. I mean, they're like a little tiny nonprofit, and even they're talking about it. The reality is, if you look at models for this kind of thing, there is a corporate housing model in the region, which is Stanford University, which houses part of their faculty in university-owned residences, both on and off campus. And so there is a model for that. Right? So.
I just want to go back for a second, Pat. The proposed business tax, because you also mentioned that in your speech. You're looking kind of possibly.
I think a lot of people
for 2020.
For 2020, yeah.
But I'm curious, what work is the City Council prepared to do this year, or do you think the City Council should do this year to prepare for that? And also, to what extent should that funding be devoted to housing as opposed to transportation, which is pretty much all I've been hearing up to this point, that this is like a great separation thing?
That's an excellent question. I don't know the answer, right? I think, my instinct is that housing and transportation are very, very much linked, right? I mean, it's not like we have one housing strategy and one transportation. I think they're much more closely linked than that, and I don't know how the split works. I mean, obviously, grade separation is going to be a huge investment on the part, and we need to sort through all that stuff. So I think that's actually a major part of the council's to-do list, right? Which is, how do we address some of this kind of stuff? But again, right, I think the step of balancing our jobs and housing growth going forward so that we're a good neighbor, right? We're not dumping large housing deficits on our neighbor cities, right? I think that's really fundamental to this. If you don't do that, then you need to make big investments, much bigger investments than you do if you achieve balance. Again, the legacy issue is one that I think we've got to figure out how to get our arms around, right? But going forward, I think at least we are nominally at the point of sustainability from a jobs housing perspective, assuming we stay there.
Can I ask one broader question?
Sure, and I have one follow-up question.
This isn't broad enough?
No, this is great, but just housing is not technically one of the City Council's priorities this year. It was last year, and there's been for a couple.
Right.
But you chose to devote a big chunk of your State of the City to this topic. Yeah, I just want to learn a little more about why you made that decision.
Well, the principle of the state of the city is you're supposed to talk, you want to talk about the future of the city, right? Mm-hmm. And I think some of the state mandates, and indeed the regional issues, have potential to have a very large bearing over time on the city. I think my guess is that if SB50 were to pass in its current form, it's probably going to be a few years till you see much, right? Because first of all, the development cycle takes a long time and so forth. But over a long period of time, I think it could have a substantial impact on the city. And the reality is, I think it could have a substantial impact on the city and not do much to the region's problem just because we're such a little piece of it, right? So, I think SB50 is more likely to have big impacts, gentrifying areas that aren't gentrified, for example, right? Palo Alto is already gentrified, right? So that's why I think this stuff has the potential to have a big impact on the city. And just because those were 4 designated priority focal areas for the council doesn't mean other stuff wasn't important too.
So one follow-up question for you on the SB50. Those images that we've seen floating around this week of the Eichler and the townhome building next to it, I want to know what kind of credence do you give to the opposition's kind of viewpoint that some things are just too harmful to quality of life, that single-family neighborhoods should remain single-family neighborhoods, because that is a factor that, well, it doesn't have anything to do with economics. It's pretty visceral. I think people have a kind of natural instinct.
No, very clearly. I mean, that's
want and don't want.
That's to really split hairs here. There's sort of 2 questions, right? One is, should we do that or not? And the other is, if we're going to generate more housing, what's the best way to do it? And so far, I've talked mostly about, I don't think SB50 and the mandates from Sacramento are the right way to do it. I think they're undemocratic, and I think they will benefit very high-income earners and nobody else. Right? I do think going back and looking at the core issue of how do we fund our region, right? I think that will make a difference, and that will actually fix it if we do it right. The question of should we do it at all? That one. That one is a values thing, right? And that's why we have elections and voters, right? Because there are some people in town who think, yeah, we ought to do that. There are other people in town who think exactly the way that you just said. And the real issue is going to be, okay, how as a society do we decide what we value here more and what the trade-offs are? And that's why I think that, that kind of judgment varies considerably from community to community. You might get a tremendously different answer, okay, in San Jose, right, for example, right? Or Hillsborough, right? Or Tracy, right? And so I think now you're into the aspect of the SB50 part is, one part is, will it work? And I think the answer is no, right? At least at its stated objectives, right? The other is it fair and consistent with how we run our country? I don't think that's the case either, right? Because those kinds of judgments and value decisions, you really need to make those locally, right? Because not everywhere one size fits all. Not everywhere in the state is the same.
Too blunt of an instrument.
It's too blunt of an instrument. Right?
Yeah. Okay. Well,
it's, one guy in Southern California called it Soviet-style central planning or something like that, right? So, yeah, we don't do that.
Of course, the supporters of the Wiener Bill would say, we tried the local control, that's why we're doing what we're doing now, because it failed. So I feel like it's a debate we'll be hearing.
Well, I think that, going and micromanaging zoning parameters in neighborhoods, that's one form of taking away local control. Going back and telling communities, look, you need to be self-sustaining so you don't beggar your neighbors on housing deficits. That's an entirely different one. That one actually makes a lot of sense to me, because the role of Sacramento ought to be, when communities do things that enrich themselves at the expense of their neighbors, that ought to not be allowed, okay? Whether it's the federal government in the states, right, or Sacramento in the cities, or cities and different neighborhoods in their own cities, right? That makes a lot of sense to me. Going back and saying, no, the answer is, we're going to be your new zoning department, and we're going to decide, 40-foot buildings on this side of the street, and 80-foot buildings on that side of the street in every community of the city. That makes very little sense to me. I think Sacramento ought to work with the existing processes of government, right? And regulate that way. as opposed to trying to take over the existing process of government, which I think makes no sense.
I think we will end on that note. Palo Alto Mayor Eric Filseth, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Nice to see you.
That wraps up this edition of Behind the Headlines. To stay up on top of all local news, you can subscribe to Express, which is our free daily newsletter that comes to your email inbox. You can find that link for subscription at paloaltoonline.com/express. We will see you next week.